Today, The Cruel Trick, an essay in corporate power and corruption. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. So here's a question. How is it that commercial interests can gain control of an important government inquiry? That's the question posed by Dale Webster over at the Regional, an independent news service for 37% of Australia's population, and growing, she says. And the article was titled, Banking Taskforce Report Opens the Gates for Mass Closures. She wrote, the number of banks closed in regional Australia in the 6 months since the Albanese government quietly released the coalition's Regional Banking Taskforce final report is comparable to a dam opening its spillways. The blame for the acceleration, at least 70 branches across all states and territories, can be laid squarely at the feet of two opposition MPs who led the inquiry, Michael Sukkar and Perrin Davey, and Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones, who released the report. Together, they gave the banks, which held the majority of seats on a task force that was investigating the impact of their own behaviour, the government endorsement they needed to continue closing branches without any repercussions for the economic and welfare mess that they're leaving behind. It was a real missed opportunity and a cruel trick to play on regional Australians who had high hopes for the first inquiry on the issue of regional bank closures in 17 years. The question needs to be asked how the banks got control of this government committee in the first place. From the setting of the terms of reference to the final recommendations, the exercise was biased towards the commercial interests of the banks, and a review of the 461 submissions reveals a scandalous list of issues and concerns that they chose to ignore in the final report. The most serious of those relate to the legality of bank behaviour and the flow-on legal impacts of their actions. The Banking Code of Conduct Compliance Committee, an independent body that monitors banks' compliance with the Banking Code of Practice, has been criticised in the past for being toothless, but felt strongly enough to highlight a possible breach of Part 4 of the Code, which relates to inclusive and accessible banking and the impact of branch closures are having, in particular, on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The committee also opened a huge legal can of worms, stating that post office providing bank post services, now expected to take up the full load of face-to-face customer service when a branch closes in a town despite not being equipped properly to do so, should also be complying with the Banking Code of Conduct. That's a legally enforceable document. The Law Society of New South Wales drew attention to access to money being restricted due to face-to-face banking being removed, leaving customers solely reliant on digital services in areas where connectivity was poor. It cited problems with two-step verification processes failing due to poor reception as an example of how people are being cut off from their funds, which raises the question of whether the terms and conditions of customer contracts are being breached. The Society also flagged legal issues relating to conducting large and difficult transactions without the assistance of a bank branch, stating the inability to conduct those fundamental aspects of business face-to-face, where online connectivity is poor, is a major failure in the bank's service proposition commitments. The impact on business growth in rural, regional and remote Australia was another major theme in the submissions. The Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, Bruce Bilson, said small businesses were finding it difficult to source locally relevant professional finance advice in places with no local bank branches, and that this was restricting timely access to capital and affecting business performance. He said loans could also be difficult to obtain in the absence of local bank staff who understands the inherent business proposition and all the value and risks of the area's residential and commercial assets, which can otherwise be difficult to ascertain for loan security. The Queensland Farmers Federation, which represents 21 member organisations, laid out all the facts to show the digital disadvantage in that state and would not be drawn into the bank's agenda by stating emphatically that because of the reasons it outlines, it does not support the closure of local bank branches. Chief Executive Dr. Georgina Davis ended the submission with, "We urge the task force to consider who we are leaving behind in our community and why." And in an impressive submission from the Berrigan Council, Karina Iyer also refused to accept the premise of the task force questions, slamming home point after point. The current framing and ordering by the task force of his questions infers that the task force operating assumption is that access to personal banking and financial services in rural and regional Australia is not a legitimate cost of doing business in a commodity-based economy, she said. Nor do the questions posed suggest the task force appreciates the financial, export-orientated, commodity-based economic reality of regional and remote Australia. Specifically, to remain competitive in global commodity markets, now more than ever, there is a need for continued investment and bank branch presence in Australia's regional, rural and remote areas. Asking questions such as what banking facilities, services and products are used in regional bank branches are quite insulting to areas where multi-million-dollar businesses are not only farms, farming enterprises and their support industries, they are industries exporting their products directly from those areas to the world. People in regional areas are asking for equity. We wonder why that is too much to ask, and having to consistently justify the need for equitable access is quite frankly odd. The question perhaps should have been, how could the banking industry better support regional areas in encouraging the growth industry investments being experienced in these areas? And just one Big Four bank left in the entire Berrigan Shire, Messiah called for a banking model that is service-based, not profit-driven. The submissions speaking to the welfare impact of bank closures in rural, regional and remote Australia are probably the most sobering though. Anne Hobson of the Theodore Chamber of Commerce in Queensland submitted a comprehensive list of vulnerable people in her town who were disadvantaged by the removal of face-to-face banking services. They included the aged, Indigenous people, those mentally unwell, those cognitively impaired, those vision impaired, those digitally marginalised through poor speeds, unreliable connections, unsatisfactory telecommunications plans and no mobile coverage. People with poor literary skills, people with poor or no digital skills, people with little control over their own documentation or how to access it, for example, domestic violence victims and those with limited education, people with no or unreliable mobile coverage who cannot do banking online from home. The task force's only answer to this was to continue to push those groups further towards digital banking and a vague recommendation for banks to, quote, improve support for regional consumers experiencing vulnerability. The Combined Pensioners and Superannuants Association of New South Wales best summed up the task force's complete disregard for the most vulnerable. There is a cohort of people who will never be able to use internet banking services for a range of reasons, it said. CPSA is of the opinion that this issue's paper does not accept that this cohort of people exists and ultimately fails to address the need for a banking services safety net that ensures every Australian, regardless of their age, technological skills and personal banking choices, has access to banking services. The task force inclusion of the term competitive neutrality in the final report reveals what it thinks of these sentiments. Under that economic philosophy, there is no place for community service obligations that would address customer welfare and inequity in the banking sector. So again, Dale asks, how did commercial interests gain control of such an important government inquiry? Well, that's a very, very critical question. And of course, we're hearing crickets from those in power. And again, you have to hypothesize, I think, that it's the power of the financial sector to influence government, which is at the heart here. This was an Aunt Sally of a review set up with the designed outcome and clearly disadvantaging many, many Australians. And by the way, not just in regional and rural areas, but even in areas in suburban Australia too. This is an outright disgrace. Therefore, I ask you to consider seriously the letter that Dale and I wrote recently to the senators asking for a proper inquiry this time before it's too late. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.